The house was an old one, built somewhere in the late 1930s, nestled quietly in a sleepy neighborhood on the outskirts of a small Midwestern town. When I first saw it, I was immediately drawn to the charm of its peeling white paint, the creaking porch swing, and the dense thicket of trees surrounding it like a secret guard. I bought it cheap, not for any grand plans, but just to get away from the chaos of city life and try to settle down somewhere peaceful. I moved in during early fall. The weather was crisp, the kind of cool that made you want to curl up with a book and a warm drink by the fire. I was alone. My wife had passed years ago, and my kids lived out of state. This was my refuge. The basement was the last thing I inspected before signing the papers. It was small, damp-smelling, and packed with decades-old junk left by the previous owners. Boxes of yellowed newspapers, broken furniture, an old water heater with rusty pipes, and scattered tools that looked like they hadn't been touched in years. The concrete floor was cracked and uneven, and the walls bore dark stains that looked like mold or something worse. At first, the basement seemed harmless. I went down occasionally to get storage boxes or to check the fuse box, but almost immediately I noticed little things that made my skin crawl. The first was the sound. At night, when the house was still and silent, I would sometimes hear a faint scraping noise coming from below. It was soft and irregular, like nails dragging against wood or metal. I chalked it up to old pipes settling or the house shifting in the cold. One evening, after dinner, I was sitting in the living room reading when I heard the sound again. This time it was louder and unmistakably coming from the basement. My curiosity won over caution. I grabbed a flashlight and crept down the narrow wooden stairs. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing the cluttered room. The noise stopped as I reached the bottom. I scanned the area, but found nothing. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I caught movement, a shadow flickering just beyond the reach of the flashlight. I swung the beam around, but there was nothing there. I told myself it was a trick of the light and started to head back up the stairs. As I placed my foot on the last step, the light flickered and went out. I cursed under my breath and fumbled for my phone to use as a light source. Just as I turned it on, I heard a soft whisper right behind me, so close it felt like breath on my neck. "Help me," I spun around, heart hammering, but saw no one. The basement was empty, save for the piles of junk and shadows dancing on the walls. I bolted up the stairs and slammed the door shut behind me. For the rest of the night, I couldn't sleep. I kept imagining a presence lurking just beyond the threshold, watching me. Over the next few weeks, the noises worsened. Scratches, knocks, whispers, sometimes almost like a voice crying out in pain. My dog, Max, refused to go near the basement door. He would growl and bark frantically whenever I tried to open it. One day, I decided to investigate more thoroughly. I cleared out some of the clutter, hoping to find a logical explanation. That's when I found the trapdoor. It was hidden beneath a dusty tarp, nailed shut but weak with age. With some effort, I pried it open. A narrow staircase descended into deeper darkness, a space that didn't appear on any of the house's original blueprints. I debated whether to go down, but my curiosity was overpowering. I took a deep breath and carefully climbed down, flashlight in hand. The air was cold and musty, smelling of earth and decay. At the bottom, the space opened into a small, cramped room with dirt walls and a dirt floor. The beam of my flashlight revealed chains hanging from the walls, rusted and old. In one corner lay a broken wooden chair, splintered and stained with dark patches. Something about the room made my blood run cold. I felt watched, as if the shadows themselves were alive. Then I noticed it. Scratches on the floor, too deep and fresh to be decades old. They formed a crude pattern, like tally marks. I counted. 13. Suddenly the flashlight flickered again and went out. I was plunged into complete darkness. I fumbled with the device, panic rising in my chest. That's when I heard it, a low, guttural growl, close enough to touch. Then scraping sounds like nails dragged across stone. I scrambled back up the stairs, nearly falling in my haste. As I reached the top, I slammed the trapdoor shut and hammered nails into it. For days after, I avoided the basement entirely. I installed new locks on the doors and even set up cameras, but nothing seemed to stop the noises. One night, around 2 a.m., I awoke to the sound of faint footsteps pacing just below my bedroom floor. The creaking grew louder, and then a whisper drifted up through the floorboards. "Why won't you let me out?" I sat frozen, trying to rationalize what I was hearing, but my heart knew the truth. The next day, I called a local historian to inquire about the house's past. The man told me the previous owner was a recluse, rumored to have kept prisoners or tortured animals in the basement, but there were no official records. Um, then, as I spoke with him, I felt a cold breeze brush past my neck, and I knew whatever was down there was still here, waiting. That night, I dreamt of the basement. In my dream, the shadows reached out, wrapping cold fingers around my ankles, pulling me down into the dark. I woke up gasping, drenched in sweat. I haven't been back to that house since. Story the end. The house was an old two-story colonial in a quiet neighborhood just outside Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I had just graduated college and landed a job downtown, so I was eager to move out of my parents' place and find something affordable yet comfortable. The house had been on the market for a while, mostly because the previous owners had died unexpectedly, and rumors floated about it being haunted. I dismissed those as typical neighborhood gossip. The day I moved in, the realtor gave me the keys and a quick rundown. She mentioned the basement was unfinished but dry, and that previous tenants used it mainly for storage. Nothing special. I was excited to have extra space. The first night I noticed the basement door, an old wooden door with peeling paint, was slightly ajar. I was sure I'd shut it earlier, but I figured I must have missed it in the dark. I closed it firmly. The next morning, the door was open again. This time, I checked thoroughly. The latch was broken. The door wouldn't stay closed on its own. I made a mental note to fix it. Down in the basement, the air was damp, but not unbearable. There were faint stains on the concrete floor and a few exposed pipes along the walls. I found some old boxes with outdated manuals and dusty photo albums, but nothing of particular interest. For the first few days, everything seemed normal, but then the noises began. At night, I'd hear thumping sounds, like footsteps moving slowly across the basement floor. Sometimes there were scraping noises against the walls, faint but persistent. I told myself it was probably the house settling, or perhaps the pipes contracting and expanding with temperature changes. One evening, I decided to investigate. I grabbed a flashlight and headed downstairs after dinner. The basement was chilly, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the shadows. I moved slowly, listening. The noises stopped the moment I reached the bottom step. I scanned the walls, the floor, the corners. There was nothing. But then I noticed the faintest scratch marks on the floor near the far corner. They looked recent. I shivered and went back upstairs, locking the basement door with a heavy chain and padlock I found in the garage. That night, I barely slept. Every creak and groan of the house set my nerves on edge. Around 3 a.m., I heard a sharp banging on the basement door. I froze, heart pounding. The noise came again, slower and heavier. I wanted to ignore it, but curiosity and fear battled inside me. I inched toward the door and shouted, "Who's there?" Silence. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight app, but the door stayed still. Then I heard a faint whisper, barely audible, coming from beneath the door. I couldn't make out the words, but it sounded like a desperate plea. The next morning, I searched online for the house's history. I found out that the previous owners had been an elderly couple. The husband had passed away suddenly in the house, and his body wasn't discovered for days because he spent much time down in the basement, working on old furniture. Neighbors mentioned strange sounds coming from the basement late at night, but they had assumed it was the old man's habits. That night, I set up a voice recorder near the basement door, hoping to catch whatever was making the noises. When I played it back, I heard a low moaning, almost like crying, mixed with the faint sound of chains dragging. I felt sick. Determined to understand, I opened the basement door the next day and began exploring deeper. Behind the laundry area, I found a narrow door built into the wall. It was barely visible under peeling wallpaper and dust. I pried it open and found a small crawl space. It smelled worse than the rest of the basement, like mold and something metallic. Inside, I discovered old rusty chains affixed to the wall and scraps of torn fabric. The walls had strange symbols scratched into the plaster. Suddenly, the temperature dropped drastically. My breath came out in white clouds. I felt a presence, cold, watching me. I slammed the door shut and locked it again, heart racing. That night, I heard footsteps again, but this time upstairs. The floorboards creaked, slow and deliberate, pacing back and forth. I grabbed a baseball bat and searched the house, but no one was there. The next morning, the front door was wide open, though I was certain I had locked it. I found muddy footprints leading toward the basement door. I never told anyone about this. My friends thought I was paranoid when I mentioned the noises. One night, I woke up to my phone ringing. It was an unknown number. When I answered, I heard a man's voice whispering, "Help me. Please help me." I froze. The voice was hoarse, broken. I wanted to say something, but no words came out. The line went dead. Terrified, I decided to move. I contacted a few people about selling the house quickly. But before I could, the basement door was found wide open again, chains on the floor, swinging slowly as if disturbed. The day I moved out, I took one last look at the basement. I noticed faint scratches on the doorframe, deep and fresh. I never returned. Even now, months later, when I close my eyes, I hear the scratching, the chains, and the whispered pleas. Story the end. It started the day we moved in. The house was older than anything we'd looked at before, built sometime in the early 1900s, nestled on the edge of a quiet street where most neighbors had lived for decades. My wife, Rachel, and I wanted a place with character, and this place had it in spades. The big porch sagged a little, the paint was peeling, but it had charm. The basement was finished, or so the listing said, with a separate entrance from the backyard. I was excited. Perfect for a workshop or maybe a rec room. On moving day, the movers shuffled boxes down the basement stairs while Rachel and I finished tidying upstairs. I went down to check on them, but the basement felt wrong from the moment I stepped on the first creaking stair. The air was thick and stale, like the scent of old paper mixed with damp earth. There was a faint hum, almost mechanical, but I couldn't place it. The walls were painted a drab olive green, and the ceiling low, with exposed pipes running like veins overhead. The carpet was threadbare in spots, and there were strange stains I didn't want to touch. I shrugged it off. Old houses have quirks. The movers finished and left, and Rachel and I sat on the porch that night, sipping cold drinks, watching fireflies dance in the early summer air. A week passed. I noticed little things about the basement. Tools left slightly out of place, the smell growing stronger, the hum becoming more pronounced in the evening. Rachel said she'd felt chilly whenever she went down there to get something. One night, she told me she heard voices. Voices? I asked, thinking maybe it was just the neighbors or wind. She nodded, looking uneasy. Whispers, like someone talking softly, but I can't understand what they're saying. I laughed nervously and promised to check it out. That night, I went down with a flashlight. The basement was dark, even with the overhead bulb on. I swept the light across the walls, the boxes stacked in one corner, the door leading to the small crawl space under the house. The hum was louder, vibrating through the floorboards. Then I saw it. Scratches on the far wall, gouges deep enough to catch the light. I crouched to inspect them. The marks were fresh. The wood beneath the paint was raw, splintered. There were fingerprints smeared in the dust. I touched them and felt a sticky residue. Dark, dried blood. My heart hammered. I told Rachel in the morning, but she just dismissed it as rodents or some animal trapped in the walls. 2 nights later, I woke to a thudding noise. It was coming from the basement. I put on my robe and crept downstairs. The basement door was ajar, though I was sure I had closed it. The light was off, but a faint red glow pulsed from behind the crawlspace door. I approached slowly. As I reached for the handle, I heard the whispering again. This time, clearer. It sounded like a woman's voice, low and urgent, repeating a single word, "Help." I flung the crawlspace door open, and a cold rush of air hit my face. Inside was pitch black. I shone the flashlight in and saw nothing but dirt and debris. Then the beam caught a shape, a small box bound with old leather straps. I pulled it out carefully. Inside were photographs. Black and white, faded. Faces of a family from long ago, a man, a woman, and a little girl with sad eyes. Beneath them, a journal, its cover brittle and stained. That morning, I read the journal. It belonged to the woman in the photos, Mary. Her entries spoke of a happy life, quickly turning to despair as her husband became abusive. The last pages were frantic. She wrote about hiding her daughter in the crawlspace, afraid her husband would find her. "Tonight he came looking," one entry said. "I hear him in the basement, pounding the walls. I don't know how much longer we can stay hidden." The last page was smeared with blood. That night, Rachel refused to stay in the house. She went to her sister's, leaving me alone. As I lay in bed, I heard it again. The thudding, the whispers. Then footsteps on the stairs. They were slow, deliberate. I sat up, heart racing. The door to our bedroom creaked open, and I saw a figure, a woman in a torn dress, hair tangled, eyes hollow. She didn't speak, just stared. Then she vanished. The next day, I called a local historian. He told me the house had a dark past. The husband had killed Mary and their daughter before disappearing himself. The police never solved the case. The crawlspace had never been searched. I hired a contractor to open the crawlspace fully. What they found was horrific. A makeshift coffin buried beneath the floorboards containing skeletal remains, likely Mary and her daughter. The husband's body was never found. After the discovery, the noises intensified. Doors slammed, lights flickered, and the whispers turned into screams. Rachel refused to come back. I stayed, trapped in a house haunted by its past. One night, I saw the woman again. She reached out, her face twisted in pain. I felt her sorrow wash over me, and I knew her story wasn't finished. I packed a bag and left, never to return. Story, the end. The house had been in the family for nearly a century. One of those old brick homes nestled at the edge of town in a place where everyone knew everyone, and secrets were carried quietly, like whispers caught in the wind. When my great-uncle died, my parents inherited the place. It was their first big property, a chance to own something solid and historical. The house had charm, high ceilings, hardwood floors worn smooth by decades of footsteps, and that kind of musty smell that older houses carry deep in their bones. But beneath all that, there was a basement. The basement was the one part of the house that no one really talked about. It was the kind of basement people avoid mentioning, like it had a personality of its own. A lot of the neighbors claimed the house was haunted, but they always looked away when they said it, as if daring to believe it would make them vulnerable. My parents were cautious but practical. The basement was old, unfinished, with cracked concrete walls and a dirt floor in some parts. It was damp, smelled of earth and mildew, and the stairs groaned underfoot. It wasn't a place to spend time, but it was where the furnace and water heater lived, so it had to be accessible. One evening, when I was 16, I came home from school late, and my parents were both out. I let myself in quietly, dropped my backpack on the floor, and went to the kitchen for a snack. The house was unusually cold for early fall, and a dampness clung to the air like fog. I shrugged it off as the old house settling in for the night. As I reached for a soda in the fridge, I heard a faint sound, a kind of scraping, low and slow, coming from downstairs. It was so subtle I almost thought I imagined it, but then it came again, like nails on wood or something dragged across concrete. Curious and a little uneasy, I went to the basement door. It was shut tight. The basement door always seemed heavier than the others, a solid slab of wood painted the same dull green as the walls. I hesitated but reached for the handle and turned it. The door creaked open. The basement was dark except for a small light above the furnace that cast long shadows. I stepped down, my footfalls echoing on the concrete steps. The air was colder than upstairs, damp and thick with the smell of earth and rust. The scraping sound stopped as soon as I descended the last step. I shone my phone's flashlight around, sweeping over piles of old furniture covered in dusty sheets, cardboard boxes stacked to the ceiling, and the furnace humming quietly in the corner. The walls were stained and cracked, and in one corner a dark patch of mold spread like a stain of night. I moved toward the far end where the sound had seemed to come from. The beam of light passed over a wooden door, roughly framed and set into the brick wall. I had never noticed that door before. It wasn't locked, but it was old, with peeling paint and rusted hinges. With a deep breath, I pulled it open. The space behind it was smaller, a narrow crawl space with dirt walls and a low ceiling. Inside, the scraping noise was louder now, as if something was moving, just out of sight. I knelt down, peering inside. That's when I saw it. There, half buried in the dirt, was a small human-shaped figure. It wasn't a doll or toy. It looked odd. Too small to be human, but it was unmistakably a figure shaped like a person, with long, thin limbs bent at unnatural angles. Its skin was grayish, and the eyes were dark holes that seemed to absorb the light. I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead. I reached to touch it, but the moment my fingers brushed the dirt near it, the scraping stopped. The crawl space fell into a silence so complete it pressed against my eardrums. I pulled back the door and climbed the stairs in a panic, heart pounding in my chest. I locked the basement door behind me and slammed it shut. The next day, I told my parents I wanted to clean out the basement to get rid of the old junk. They seemed hesitant but agreed. We got some boxes and started going through the clutter, but the memory of the crawlspace figure haunted me. That night, I had a nightmare so vivid I woke up gasping for air. In the dream, I was back in the basement, crawling toward that small door. The figure was there again, but this time, it was alive. Its eyes glowed red, and it whispered my name in a voice like gravel scraping stone. It reached out with those long, spindly fingers, and I couldn't move or scream. When I woke, my room was cold, and the faintest scratching noise came from the walls. Over the next week, strange things happened. My parents started hearing noises too. Footsteps below the floor, scratching sounds behind the walls, and whispers that stopped when anyone tried to listen. Objects moved on their own. I found tools from the basement upstairs, out of place and covered in dirt. Lights flickered without explanation. The neighborhood dogs refused to come near the house, growling at the windows. One afternoon, my mom called me from work, her voice shaky. She said she'd found deep scratches on the basement door, claw marks that hadn't been there before. My dad was adamant it was just the old wood cracking, but even he seemed unsettled. I was determined to get to the bottom of it. I borrowed a flashlight and went down to explore the crawlspace again. The small door was slightly ajar, as if someone or something had pushed it open. I climbed down on my hands and knees, the dirt cold and crumbly beneath me. The figure was gone. Instead, the earth was freshly disturbed, like something had been dug up and removed recently. I crawled back up and slammed the door shut. That night, the house shook with a low rumbling noise. The lights went out completely, plunging the house into darkness. I heard a sound like something heavy moving beneath the floorboards, followed by a long, high-pitched scream that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I hid under my blanket, shivering as the sounds continued for what felt like hours. The next morning, I found deep gouges scratched into the wooden floor in the basement, gouges that formed a crude circle around the crawlspace door. When I told my parents, they finally called a local handyman to check the basement for structural issues or pests. The handyman came during the day and spent several hours inspecting. He found nothing wrong with the structure, but looked visibly uncomfortable. Later, he told my parents in private that the basement was colder than it should be, almost unnaturally so. He refused to explain further. Things got worse. My dad started waking up with bruises on his arms and legs. My mom's hair began falling out in clumps. I felt watched constantly, like unseen eyes followed me wherever I went. One night, my dad disappeared. He had gone down to the basement to check the furnace and never came back up. We searched the whole house and yard but found no sign of him. The only clue was the basement door, hanging open just a crack and a strange wet trail leading down the stairs. I refused to go down there, but my mom insisted. She brought police, but they found nothing. No footprints, no fingerprints, no signs of forced entry or struggle. Just the basement, empty and silent, except for the steady drip of water from a leaky pipe. Weeks passed. The house seemed to change. The air grew colder, the shadows longer. The basement door stayed open like a silent invitation. One night, I heard my dad's voice whispering through the walls, calling my name in a broken, desperate tone. I tried to leave, but every time I packed a bag, the power would go out, and the voice would grow louder, more insistent. Eventually, I stopped trying. Now I live in the house alone. I avoid the basement at all costs. Sometimes, when the lights flicker, I see shapes moving in the shadows just beyond sight. Sometimes I hear scratching beneath the floor. And sometimes, late at night, the basement door creaks open by itself. Story the end. The house was cheap, and that was the main reason I took it. I'd been hunting for a place for months after my last apartment became too expensive, and this one slipped through my fingers at a price I couldn't ignore. It was an old Victorian-style home in a rundown neighborhood, the kind of place that might have seen better days a century ago. The realtor warned me that the basement was unfinished and damp, but wasn't a deal breaker. I was used to older buildings with quirks, creaking floors, drafty windows, weird smells, and this one had character. The basement door was tucked away in the kitchen under the stairs, and it always seemed to close with a little extra effort. The lock was rusty but functional. The realtor had told me it was mostly used for storage, old furniture, paint cans, the remnants of a previous tenant's life, but I figured I'd clean it up and make it my own. The first night in the house, I barely noticed the basement. I was exhausted from moving in, unpacking boxes, and dealing with a week's worth of logistics. The creaks and groans of the old house felt normal. I'd grown up around these kinds of places. It was only after I went to bed that I started to hear things. At first, it was faint, a soft tapping like fingers lightly drumming on wood. I thought maybe a branch against the window, or the pipes settling. But the tapping seemed to come from beneath me, from somewhere in the basement below the kitchen floor. I sat up, listening closely, but the sound stopped. I told myself it was nothing. Over the next few nights, the sounds became more persistent. The tapping changed into scratching, irregular and harsh, like nails against concrete or claws on wood. I began waking up almost every night around 2 or 3 a.m., hearing these noises that seemed to echo through the floor. Sometimes I'd hear a low, guttural groan beneath the scratching, a sound so chilling I couldn't explain it logically. One night, I heard a voice. It wasn't speaking. It was a whisper, almost like someone trying to form words but choking on them. I froze in bed, heart pounding. The whisper didn't last long, but it was enough to shatter the fragile sense of safety I had. I started avoiding the basement altogether. I kept the door shut and locked, even though it annoyed me to do so. I told myself that old houses creaked and made weird noises, that I was being paranoid, but deep down, I was scared. One afternoon, I decided to check the basement. I told myself I needed to get over the fear. I pulled open the door, and a musty, stale air hit me like a wall. The basement was a typical old house cellar. Unfinished concrete floors and walls, exposed pipes, cobwebs everywhere. A single bare bulb hung from the ceiling, as if flickering weakly. I stepped down the stairs slowly, my footsteps echoing. The air was colder here, and I felt a sudden shiver run down my spine. I reached the bottom and shone my flashlight around. In the far corner, covered in dust and cobwebs, was a rusted metal door that hadn't been mentioned in the listing or by the realtor. Curious, I tried the handle. It was locked. I knocked gently, half expecting an answer. Nothing. That night, the scratching became frantic, claws digging into wood and concrete. Then came the banging, loud, thudding noises like something heavy being thrown against the basement door. I sat frozen in bed, listening as the noises faded into silence. The next day, I found the metal door unlocked. Somehow, the lock had been snapped off. I didn't know what to expect. Heart hammering, I grabbed a crowbar and pried it open. Beyond was a narrow stairway leading down into a darkness that my flashlight couldn't penetrate. The air was damp and smelled of rot and earth. I climbed down, the stairs creaking beneath me. At the bottom was a small chamber, barely lit by the beam of my flashlight. The walls were lined with old, rotting wood. There were chains attached to the walls, some with rusted shackles dangling. On the floor lay scraps of torn fabric, bits of bone, and something that looked like dried blood. I wanted to run, but something made me stay. Then I saw it, a figure huddled in the corner, thin and pale, barely moving. Its eyes reflected the flashlight beam, dull and hollow. I stumbled back, tripping over debris. The figure didn't move, but I could hear ragged breathing. I ran upstairs and slammed the door, locking it behind me. I called the police immediately. When they arrived, they took my statement seriously, but were skeptical about the figure I described. They searched the basement and the hidden chamber. They found chains and evidence of recent use, but no sign of any person. The officers told me the house had once been owned by a recluse, rumored to keep prisoners in the basement decades ago. There were whispers of disappearances, but no concrete evidence. I moved out the next day. The memories haunt me. Sometimes when I close my eyes, I see that figure still crouching in the dark, watching. And late at night, sometimes I still hear the scratching, the tapping, the breathing beneath my feet. Story the end. The house we moved into was old, built in the early 1950s, the kind with creaky floorboards and that faint, lingering smell of damp wood and forgotten years. I was 22, fresh out of college, and desperate for a place I could afford in the city. The rent was surprisingly low, almost suspiciously so, but it was a two-bedroom with a basement, and it was close to work. My girlfriend and I jumped at the chance. We didn't really notice the basement much at first. It was mostly unfinished. A concrete floor and bare cinder block walls painted a sickly off-white. The landlord told us it was great for storage, but warned against using it for anything else because of moisture and old wiring. We laughed it off, thinking of it as a useful extra space for old boxes and holiday decorations. The first few nights were normal. We got settled, unpacked, and made the place feel like home. But then, weird things started happening. It began with the noises. At first, it was just creaking and popping sounds, nothing unusual in an old house, right? But the creaking didn't match the time of day or temperature changes. It was more deliberate, like footsteps. Heavy, slow, pacing footsteps moving from one corner of the basement to another. One night I was lying in bed and heard it distinctly, the slow shuffle of feet, pausing, then dragging slightly, as if someone with a limp was walking down there. My heart pounded, but I told myself it was just the house settling. I convinced my girlfriend, Emily, that I was imagining things. She was tired and didn't hear anything, but the noises didn't stop. They got worse. Sometimes it wasn't just footsteps. It was scratching, sharp, frantic scratching along the walls, sometimes near the corners, sometimes near the old fuse box. The kind of sound that makes your skin crawl. We checked for mice or rats. There was nothing. No signs of rodents anywhere. The landlord insisted there were no animals in the walls or basement. But the sounds continued. One evening, Emily volunteered to check the basement while I cooked dinner. I told her to be careful and not to stay down there long. 10 minutes later, she was back upstairs, pale and shaken. "There's something wrong down there," she whispered. "What do you mean?" She said the air felt off, thick and cold, like the basement wasn't just damp. It was stale in a wrong way. She told me she thought she saw shadows flicker at the far corner near the stairs, but when she looked directly, there was nothing. The lights buzzed strangely too, and the bulbs flickered even though they weren't old. I didn't know what to say. I wanted to believe her, but part of me was skeptical. That night, I stayed up late, listening. Around 2 a.m., the footsteps started again, slow and deliberate. I grabbed a flashlight and crept to the basement door. The cold seeped out immediately as I opened it, a biting cold that didn't fit the weather outside. I shined the light down the stairs. The basement was empty, but the beam caught a strange glint near the far wall, a tiny, bright reflection from something metallic. I stepped down cautiously, heart racing. Closer, I saw it. A small, old-fashioned pocket watch, half buried in the dust. The glass face was cracked, the hands frozen at 3:17. I picked it up. The second hand twitched once, then stopped. The basement felt colder, the air heavier. I dropped the watch back down and hurried upstairs. After that, the atmosphere in the house changed. Emily and I started having nightmares, dreams of being trapped in dark, endless tunnels beneath the house with something following us, breathing heavy and slow. Sometimes we woke up hearing whispering, words we couldn't understand, spoken in a low growl. One night, the basement door slammed shut with a violent bang. I bolted awake to the sound. Emily was trembling beside me. "We have to get out," she said, tears in her eyes. I agreed, but I didn't want to give up without trying to understand what was happening. We researched the house's history and found something disturbing. The previous owners had been a family, a father, mother, and young daughter. A tragedy had struck there 20 years ago. The daughter had disappeared, and despite police searches, she was never found. Rumors said she had been abducted and killed, possibly in or near the basement. The landlord had never mentioned it. That night, I decided to go down to the basement one last time. I brought a tape recorder and a camera, determined to document anything unusual. The basement was darker than usual, and bulbs flickered, casting long shadows. The air was thick, like breathing through wet cloth. I called out softly, "Is anyone here?" Static crackled from the recorder, then a faint voice whispered, "Help me." My blood ran cold. I swung the camera toward the far corner. There I saw a faint outline of a small figure, hunched over. The shadows seemed to twist and writhe as if the figure was trapped between dimensions. Suddenly, the air went icy, and the lights exploded into darkness. I fumbled for my phone's flashlight and aimed it toward the stairs. A cold hand gripped my ankle. I screamed and tried to pull away, but the grip tightened, claw-like and desperate. The voice whispered again, "Find me." I kicked and scrambled upstairs, slamming the door behind me. I didn't stop until I was outside, breathing hard in the cold night air. Emily found me there, and I told her everything. We packed and left the next day. The house still stands, empty now. Sometimes I drive by and catch a glimpse of the basement window, dark and watching. I never found out what happened to that girl or what haunted that basement. But sometimes late at night, I swear I hear faint scratching beneath my own floorboards. Story the end. I moved into the house when I was 27, fresh out of a rough breakup and desperate for a fresh start. The neighborhood was quiet, almost too quiet, in a sleepy Pennsylvania suburb about 20 minutes outside of Philadelphia. The house was old, built sometime in the 1920s with peeling paint and a sagging porch. But the rent was cheap, and the landlord was eager to fill it after the previous tenants left abruptly. I figured I could handle some quirks for the price. The basement was the first thing I noticed when I toured the place. The stairs were narrow and steep, made of creaking wood, descending into total darkness with no windows or natural light. The landlord mentioned it was unfinished, and I could use it for storage or laundry. I thought little of it at the time, having never been bothered by basements before. The first few weeks went smoothly. I unpacked my things, bought some basic furniture, and settled into a routine of work, eating, and Netflix at night. The basement remained a place I visited only to do laundry or grab extra supplies. There was a faint, musty smell, but I assumed it was just old house odors and the dampness that inevitably came with basements in older homes. One evening, about 3 weeks after moving in, I was downstairs folding laundry when I noticed something odd. The basement felt colder than usual, and a faint dripping sound echoed somewhere beyond the furnace. I followed the sound, flashlight in hand, until I came to a corner behind a stack of old cardboard boxes. The wall there was cracked, and moisture seeped through, creating a small puddle on the floor. I tried to ignore the feeling of being watched as I pulled some boxes aside to get to the corner. Among the boxes was a collection of old, tattered newspapers and some broken furniture parts, but nothing particularly interesting. I wiped the water and went back upstairs. That night I couldn't sleep. The house was silent except for the occasional creaks and pops of settling wood, but every hour or so I thought I heard faint tapping sounds like nails lightly knocking on wood coming from the basement. I told myself it was just the house settling and eventually fell asleep. The next day I started noticing things missing. Small things. My favorite coffee mug disappeared from the kitchen counter. The screwdriver I had left on the workbench in the basement was gone. At first, I blamed myself, thinking maybe I misplaced things during cleaning or unpacking. But then one night, I found a folded scrap of paper taped to the basement door from the inside. The handwriting was scratchy and faint, and the paper smelled damp. It read, "Stop looking." My skin crawled, but I didn't show anyone. I thought maybe the landlord's kids or one of the neighbors was messing with me. But when I mentioned it to the landlord, he looked uncomfortable and told me there were no kids living nearby. After that, the basement became a place I dreaded. Every time I went down, the air grew colder, heavier. I started hearing whispers, barely audible, unintelligible, but definitely voices. The tapping got louder and more frequent, sometimes in patterns, almost like Morse code. One late evening, after a long day at work, I finally broke down and called a friend, Mark, to come help me check the basement for whatever might be causing the sounds. Mark was skeptical, but agreed to come over after work. When he arrived, we went down together. The basement was dark, the flashlight beams dancing nervously on the concrete walls. Mark joked about it being haunted, but I wasn't laughing. We started near the furnace, then moved toward the far corner where the wall was cracked and damp. That's when Mark stopped. "Do you see that?" he asked, pointing at a section of the floor near the cracked wall. There were faint scratches etched into the concrete, deep enough to catch the light. They looked like letters, but incomplete, worn away with age. I crouched down to examine them closer. "Help me clear the dirt off," I said. Together, we brushed away years of grime and dust. After a few minutes, we could make out the phrase, Let me out. My heart was pounding. I had no idea what to say. Then, Mark noticed something else. Alongside the scratched message, there was a tiny hole, about the size of a fist, in the corner where the wall met the floor. It was dark inside, and cold air puffed out every few seconds in short bursts, almost like it was breathing. We both felt uneasy, but curiosity got the better of us. I grabbed a crowbar from the laundry area and began to pry at the cracked wall beside the hole. The cement crumbled slowly, revealing a deeper cavity behind it. Suddenly, the tapping stopped. The basement went deathly silent except for the low hum of the furnace. Then faint scraping sounds came from inside the cavity, followed by a soft, desperate thud. I froze. Mark's face went pale. "We shouldn't be doing this," he said. But I couldn't stop. I kept prying until the hole was big enough to peer inside. The beam of my flashlight revealed a small, narrow space, barely big enough to crawl through. There was something else, a smell. Rotten, metallic, and unmistakably human. I wanted to step back, but then I saw it. At the back of the cavity was a hand, pale, thin, with broken fingernails. Mark pushed me aside, pulled out his phone, and called 911. By the time the police arrived, we had cleared enough debris to access the cavity fully. They sent in a forensic team who pulled out a small wooden box from inside the wall. Inside the box was a human body, a young woman, no older than 25, with dark hair tangled around her face. Her eyes were closed and she wore a faded dress. The coroner later confirmed she had been dead for decades, possibly since the 1950s or earlier. There were no signs of trauma, but the body had been buried alive, sealed in that box and walled inside the basement. The police opened an investigation, but no leads ever emerged. The house was put on the market, but no one wanted to live there afterward. I moved out the following week, feeling the weight of her presence everywhere I went. At night, I still hear tapping, soft whispers, and sometimes, when the wind blows just right, I swear I hear her voice calling from the darkness below. Story the end. Moving into the old house at the edge of town was supposed to be a fresh start. After my divorce, I wanted something quiet, affordable, and a little isolated. The house was built in the early 1900s with creaky floors, peeling wallpaper, and a basement that smelled like damp earth and forgotten years. The landlord warned me, almost offhand, "The basement's been sealed for decades, but the stairs are still there. Best not to go down unless you have to." I nodded and told myself it was just an old house quirk, something typical of these aging properties. The first week passed with little incident. I was busy unpacking boxes and trying to get used to the silence. One night, while folding laundry in the living room, I thought I heard a faint thud from below. Pausing, I listened, but it was gone. I chalked it up to the house settling. Then came the smell. It was subtle at first, musty, like wet wood mixed with something rotten. It seemed to seep up through the floorboards near the kitchen. I tried to ignore it, but it was persistent. I checked the basement door, which was old and painted shut, and I could feel a cold draft sneaking out from the cracks beneath it. A few nights later, I woke up to the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from beneath my bedroom floor. My heart pounding, I got out of bed and moved cautiously toward the door. The footsteps stopped abruptly. I convinced myself it was a dream. By the second week, the noises became more frequent. Faint whispers I couldn't understand, dragging sounds, the occasional knock on the basement door. One evening, I worked late, and as I returned home, the front door was slightly ajar. Inside, the house was freezing cold. I called out, but no one answered. As I walked toward the basement door to close it tightly, I noticed scratch marks on the wood, deep, long, fresh. Freaked out, I called the landlord. He admitted that the previous tenant had left suddenly, refusing to explain why. "People say they see things down there," he said, voice low. "I've kept the basement sealed for years, but sometimes something slips through." I couldn't sleep that night. Around 3 a.m., the whispering returned, clearer this time. It was a voice, soft but chilling. "Help me." Desperate for answers, I managed to pry open the basement door the next day. The stairs were steep, covered in dust and cobwebs. At the bottom was a faint light flickering, coming from a room I hadn't known existed. Inside, the walls were covered in old newspaper clippings, strange symbols, and photographs of people I didn't recognize, their eyes scratched out. Suddenly, I heard the basement door slam shut above me. The temperature dropped drastically. Shadows moved at the edge of my vision. I tried to climb the stairs, but the steps seemed to shift, elongate, trapping me below. The whispers turned to screams, begging for release. I passed out and woke up hours later in my bed. The basement door was open, the smell gone. But when I checked, the strange room was empty, just a bare concrete wall. The photographs, symbols, and clippings had vanished. I moved out the next day. Story the end. The first time I noticed something was wrong with the basement was about 2 weeks after I moved into my new apartment. I'd never been the type to be spooked easily, but the old building had a vibe that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The landlord told me it was an early 1900s structure and that the basement was mostly used for storage. I didn't care much for that kind of history. I just wanted a cheap place in the city where I could be on my own and focus on my work. But the basement soon became something I dreaded. At first, it was just little things. I'd come home from work late, dead tired, and the basement door, off the hallway near my front door, would be slightly ajar. Not wide open, just cracked enough that if I wasn't paying attention, I might miss it. I always locked it before leaving, or at least I thought I did. Sometimes I'd swear I could hear faint tapping noises from down below, like someone running their fingers along the wooden support beams. But when I went down to check, nothing was there. I chalked it up to my imagination. Old buildings settle and make noises. The pipes groan, the wind whistles through cracks. But even that explanation began to fall apart. One evening, I came home around 10 p.m. and felt unusually cold in the hallway. I live in the city, so the heat is usually cranked in winter. The door to the basement was still locked, but I had the distinct feeling someone or something was watching me. I glanced over my shoulder but saw nothing. I shook off the feeling and went to my bedroom, but the unease clung to me like a second skin. A few nights later, I was in bed when I heard the basement door creak open. It was a slow, deliberate sound, not the typical squeak an old door makes when slammed. I got up and crept to the hallway. The light switch next to the basement door flickered on and off, then died completely. The bulb had blown, I figured, but the timing was strange. I never thought the bulb was weak. I grabbed a flashlight and slowly descended the basement stairs. The musty smell hit me hard, mixed with something sour and metallic I couldn't place. The basement was pitch black, except for my flashlight beam cutting through the thick darkness. I scanned the walls and piles of forgotten boxes. Then I saw it. Deep scratches along the wall near the furnace. Long, jagged marks that hadn't been there before. It looked like something had tried to claw its way out. My heart started pounding. I tried to tell myself it was just some animal, maybe a rat or a raccoon, but that didn't explain the smell or the sense of dread settling over me like a storm cloud. I moved out of that apartment a week later. A few years passed before I experienced something like that again. This time, it was in my childhood home. My parents had moved to a different state and left me the house when they downsized. The basement was the same, dark, damp, with the usual cobwebs and old boxes stacked in the corners. But I knew every creak and groan of that house like the back of my hand. Then the whispers started. I was sitting in the living room one late evening when I heard faint voices coming from the basement. At first, it sounded like a radio left on somewhere, static mixed with a low murmur. Then the words became clearer. I swear I heard my name. Soft, urgent, drawn out like a desperate plea. I forced myself down the basement stairs, flashlight in hand, heart hammering in my chest. The voices stopped as soon as I hit the bottom step. I swept the beam around the room, but there was no one there. Just old furniture, dusty boxes, and shadows clinging to the corners. That night, I barely slept. Over the next few days, the voices became more frequent. Sometimes they would whisper from the walls themselves. I tried recording the sounds, but when I played the tapes back, there was only static, nothing else. No voices, no noises, just dead silence. I asked my mom if she'd ever noticed anything strange about the basement. She hesitated, then told me a story my father had never shared. Apparently, decades ago, the basement had been used to imprison a man accused of theft. He was kept chained down there for days until the sheriff arrived to take him away. Some neighbors said they heard his screams at night. My parents never wanted to speak of it, but the memory lingered like a stain. I started feeling like I wasn't alone down there, like something was trapped in the darkness, angry and restless. One night, I heard a loud bang coming from the basement. I ran down to find the furnace door swinging open, the flame inside flickering wildly. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw a figure standing just beyond the light's edge, pale, indistinct, but unmistakably human-shaped. I blinked, and it was gone. I locked the basement door and placed heavy furniture in front of it. But the presence didn't stop. Sometimes I'd wake to the sound of chains rattling softly beneath the floorboards. Once, I even found scratch marks on the basement door, as if someone or something was trying to get out. I moved away soon after. The house was sold, but I still think about that basement sometimes, especially on cold nights when the wind is howling. I wonder if the restless spirit is still trapped down there, waiting for someone to hear its cries. Basements aren't just storage spaces. Sometimes they hold shadows that never leave. Story the end. The day I moved into my new place, I felt a mix of excitement and unease I couldn't quite place. The house was an old brick bungalow on the outskirts of Dayton, Ohio. The price was right, but I knew it had been on the market for a while. The previous owner was an elderly man who had passed away, and the neighbors were quiet when I asked about the place. They seemed polite, but distant, as if they wanted to avoid talking about it. The basement was unfinished and cluttered with decades of forgotten junk. I spent the first weekend hauling out broken furniture, boxes filled with old newspapers and rusted tools. The concrete walls were cold and damp, with the faint smell of mildew hanging in the air. I didn't mind. Basements like that were common in houses this age. I planned to clean it up, maybe turn it into a workshop. On my second night, I heard noises, soft at first, a thud, like something heavy dropping on the floor. Then a scraping sound, slow and deliberate, like nails or claws dragged across concrete. It was coming from the basement. I told myself it was probably just the house settling or some stray animal. Still, I checked the basement door. It was closed and locked. I shone a flashlight under it. Nothing. Sleep didn't come easy. I tried to brush off the sounds, but they persisted over the next few nights. Sometimes I'd hear the thud-thud-thud of footsteps pacing the floor, even when I was downstairs alone. One night, the noise was louder. A scraping followed by a series of thumps, almost rhythmic. It stopped abruptly, and then I heard a whisper, so faint I almost thought I imagined it. The whisper sounded like someone calling my name. I froze. The hairs on my neck stood up. I never heard anything that clear before. The next day, I asked the neighbors again. They seemed reluctant, exchanging glances before one finally spoke. "That basement, it's best you don't go down there alone at night," she said. The old man had habits. He kept things locked away, things no one wanted to see. I pressed her for details, but she just shook her head. "You'll find out soon enough." That night, curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed a flashlight and headed down. The basement was colder than usual. My light caught on a small door set into the far wall, almost hidden behind some shelves. It was locked, but the lock was old and rusted. With some effort, I forced it open. Inside was a narrow tunnel, just wide enough for a person to crawl through. The air was stale and thick, with a coppery scent, like blood. I shined my light down the passage. It stretched back for what seemed like forever, into pitch darkness. I wanted to turn around, but something drew me forward. As I crawled inside, I noticed scratches on the walls, deep and jagged, as if something had clawed at the wood framing. Then I saw stains, dark, sticky patches that gleamed in the flashlight beam. A sudden coldness swept through the tunnel. I heard breathing, not mine. Heavy, ragged, and close. I froze. A whisper echoed around me, growing louder, forming words, "Help me." Panic surged, and I scrambled back out, slamming the door behind me. From that night on, the basement felt alive. The noises grew worse, chains dragging, soft crying, thus footsteps pacing. I would find the basement door wide open in the mornings, though I was certain I locked it the night before. One morning, I found strange marks on the concrete floor, shallow gouges arranged in a circle around where the small door was. I tried to tell myself it was my imagination, but then Milo, my cat, disappeared. He was always cautious of the basement, never venturing near it. One evening, I heard his frantic meowing from below, but when I got to the basement door, he was nowhere to be seen. Days passed with no sign of him. I started hearing voices at night, low, desperate whispers begging for release. I began to see shadows moving at the edge of my vision, flickering just beyond the basement door. I called a priest. He came, blessed the house, and prayed over the basement. When he approached the tunnel, he recoiled, saying, "This place holds something evil." Despite the blessings, the presence didn't leave. One night, I woke to the basement door creaking open. I got up to close it, but stopped when I heard a voice right behind me, whispering in my ear, "Don't leave me here." I spun around. No one. I moved out the next day. I left the house empty, sealed the basement door from the outside. Months later, I still dream of that basement, the tunnel stretching endlessly, the whispering voices, and the chilling cold. And sometimes when I'm alone, I swear I hear my cat meowing from beneath my feet. Story the end. The old house on Millbrook Avenue wasn't much to look at. I bought it as an investment, a fixer-upper that nobody wanted because of its age and the rumors that clung to it like the peeling wallpaper inside. The basement was the biggest reason I got the place so cheap. It was finished, supposedly, but when I first saw it, I knew something was off. The air was stale, thick with a smell that reminded me of damp earth mixed with something metallic, like old rusted blood. At first, I thought the smell was just from years of neglect. The paint on the walls was chipped, and the floorboards creaked underfoot. The basement was cramped, but could be converted into a rental space or at least a nice workshop. I made plans to clean it out and fix the wiring. But the deeper I went into that basement, the more I felt like I was stepping into someone else's private nightmare. I remember the first time I actually spent any time down there. It was a Sunday afternoon, and I was eager to clear out the cobwebs and see what condition the wiring was in. The basement stairs groaned under my weight. I flicked the light switch, and the bulbs flickered erratically before settling into a dull glow. That was when I noticed the faint scratching noises coming from the far corner near the storage closet. I thought it was rodents at first. Rats or mice hiding in the walls or under the floorboards. I set traps and left a bucket of poison out. The next day, the noises were gone, but the smell was worse. I opened the storage closet door, which was jammed but gave way with a shove. Inside, nothing but old boxes and tools coated in thick dust. But then I saw the floor beneath the boxes. The wood was scarred with deep claw marks and smeared in something dark and sticky that I hoped was just rust or old grease. That night, I dreamt of a child in the basement. She was pale, with dark eyes that seemed to pierce through the shadows. She whispered my name, barely audible but filled with urgency. I woke up soaked in sweat, my heart pounding. I chalked it up to exhaustion and stress from the move. But the dreams didn't stop. Each night, the same girl appeared, always whispering, sometimes crying. She never said much, just stared at me with those empty eyes, and sometimes reached out with small, trembling hands. One evening, after a long day of renovations upstairs, I went down to check the basement again. The air felt heavier this time, as if something was watching me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. As I approached the storage closet, I heard that scratching again, louder this time, like nails scraping slowly across the walls. I froze, flashlight trembling in my hand. The beam caught something moving, a shadow darting just out of sight. I called out, but only silence answered. I started to feel paranoid. I installed a camera in the basement, hoping to catch whatever was causing the noises. The next morning, I reviewed the footage. For hours, nothing. Then, around 2 a.m., the camera showed a faint figure moving near the storage closet. It was translucent, barely visible, but definitely a child. She looked straight at the camera, her eyes dark voids. The chill in the air became unbearable. I told a friend about the footage, and he suggested I speak to a local historian. I found an old man named Mr. Hawkins who had lived in the neighborhood for over 50 years. When I showed him the footage, his face went pale. "That house," he said quietly, "has a dark past. Back in the 1940s, a little girl named Emily lived there with her parents. She disappeared one night, and they never found her. The search went on for weeks, but no trace was ever found. They say her spirit never left." I asked if the basement had any history. He nodded slowly. The basement was used as a root cellar. Some say Emily was locked in there by accident, and the door was sealed. Nobody ever checked. She died down there. I felt sick. Determined to find closure, I decided to explore the basement fully. I brought a crowbar to open the floorboards near the storage closet. It was difficult, but eventually I pried up a panel. Beneath was a hollow space filled with dirt and debris. As I shone my flashlight inside, I saw small bones, too small for an animal, a child's remains. I called the police. They took over the investigation and confirmed the bones were human. The neighborhood was shaken by the news. But after the discovery, the basement became unbearable. Doors slammed on their own, lights flickered violently. The scratching turned into pounding, like fists hitting the walls. At night, I heard sobbing, begging. I moved out less than a month later, unable to live with the oppressive atmosphere. The house sat empty again, the basement sealed tight. I still have the camera footage saved, and sometimes when I watch it in the dark, I see that little girl's face staring back. Waiting. Story the end. The house was one of those old places that people in our town passed by with a mix of curiosity and unease. It sat at the edge of a quiet neighborhood, a brick colonial built sometime in the early 1900s. My family bought it a few years ago when I was in college, mostly because it was affordable and had potential, as the real estate agent kept saying. The basement was huge, unfinished, cold, and smelling of damp earth and old wood. We never used it for anything except storage and the furnace. At first, the basement was just another dark corner of the house. My mom kept the laundry down there, and my dad stored some of his tools and old furniture. I was never fond of going down those creaky wooden stairs. The air always felt heavy, almost suffocating, and the shadows moved in ways that made my skin crawl. One night, after my parents went out for a late dinner, I was home alone. I heard a noise from downstairs, a soft scraping sound like nails dragging across concrete. It was faint, but definitely there. I told myself it was probably just a mouse or something settling in the walls, but curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed a flashlight and crept down the basement stairs. The steps creaked beneath me, and the air got colder as I descended. I shined the flashlight across the room, illuminating boxes stacked haphazardly, rusty tools, and the furnace that hummed quietly in the corner. Then I noticed something strange, a faint, sickly sweet smell that didn't belong. It was like rotting fruit mixed with damp soil. I followed the scent to a corner of the basement I'd never paid much attention to. There was a small door, half hidden behind a pile of old plywood. The door was made of rough wood, and the paint was peeling off in long strips. I don't know why, but I felt compelled to open it. I pushed the door open slowly, and the scraping sound stopped instantly. Behind it was a narrow crawl space, barely tall enough to kneel in. The walls were damp dirt, and the ground was covered in a thin layer of mud. As I shone my light in, something caught my eye, a dark shape partially buried in the mud. I moved closer, heart pounding. It was a small, misshapen figure, no bigger than a child, covered in dirt and grime. Its limbs were twisted at unnatural angles, and its face was obscured by clumps of wet mud. I felt a sudden chill and stepped back, closing the door quickly. That night, I couldn't sleep. The image of the figure haunted me, and every time I closed my eyes, I heard that scraping sound again. I tried telling my parents, but they just brushed it off as old house noises. Still, something about that basement corner felt wrong. Over the next week, strange things started happening. Doors would open and close on their own. Lights flickered without cause. I found scratches on the basement door, deep and jagged, like something had been clawing at it. Once I swore I saw a shadow dart just out of sight. One evening, my dad went down to fix a leak near the furnace. He was down there for hours, and when he finally came back up, he looked pale and shaken. He wouldn't say what had happened, only that he didn't want to go back down. A few days later, my mom and I went down together to clean up the basement. As we moved boxes away from that corner, the air grew inexplicably colder. The same sickly sweet smell filled the space. My flashlight flickered, and I thought I heard whispering just at the edge of hearing. Then I saw the scratches on the dirt floor. They formed a circle, roughly drawn, with strange symbols etched inside. I took a picture, but when I looked at it on my phone, the symbols seemed to blur and shift. That night, the nightmares began. I dreamed of the figure in the crawl space, its face now clear. Pale, cracked skin stretched tight over hollow eyes, its mouth stretched wide in a silent scream. It whispered my name, calling me back to the basement. I woke up drenched in sweat. One morning, my parents were gone. Their beds were untouched, but their cars were missing from the driveway. The house was eerily silent. I searched everywhere, calling their names, but no answer. The only clue was the basement door, standing wide open. I hesitated, then went down. The basement was darker than usual, colder, and the smell was overwhelming. The circle on the floor had grown larger, and the symbols glowed faintly in the dim light. In the center of the circle was a mound of disturbed dirt. Suddenly, a hand burst out of the ground, pale, dirty, with long fingers ending in cracked nails. The hand gripped the edge of the circle and pulled upward, revealing my dad's terrified face. His eyes were wide with panic. He gasped, "Get out! Get out now!" and then collapsed back into the dirt. I scrambled back upstairs, slamming the door shut behind me. I called 911, but by the time help arrived, the basement was empty again. No sign of my parents, no handprints, no footprints. The dirt mound was undisturbed. No one believed me. The police said they found no evidence of foul play or missing persons. My parents never returned. The house was eventually sold, and I moved away. But sometimes when I'm alone at night, I still hear the scraping. I can't forget the way the basement door creaks open on its own, inviting me back into that cold, dark place where something waits just beneath the earth, whispering my name. Story the end. The old house had been a fixer-upper from the moment I first saw it. It was a two-story colonial tucked in a quiet neighborhood, built sometime in the early 1900s. The kind of place that came with creaky floors, peeling wallpaper, and a basement that smelled like mold and forgotten memories. I was new to town, desperate to find a place to live on a tight budget, and the house's price was too good to pass up. The previous owners had left in a hurry, the realtor said, and it had sat vacant for months. I moved in on a crisp autumn afternoon, carrying boxes up the narrow stairs. My plan was simple: clean it up, fix what I could, and make it feel like home. The basement was just a storage space, or so I thought. It was unfinished, with bare concrete walls, exposed pipes, and a low ceiling that made me stoop when I went down. The air was cold and damp, and the flickering light bulb barely penetrated the darkness. At first, the basement was just a place to put old furniture, seasonal decorations, and the tools I brought with me. But soon I started noticing strange things. It began subtly, a faint scratching sound like nails dragging against wood, coming from the far corner behind a stack of boxes. Sometimes I'd hear it late at night when the rest of the house was silent. Other times it was a soft tapping, rhythmic but erratic, almost like someone trying to get my attention. I'd stand in the basement, shining my flashlight, but I never saw anything. I told myself it was just the house settling or mice. I didn't want to believe otherwise. One night I woke up at 3:13 a.m. to a noise that stopped my heart. Breathing. It was slow, wet, and ragged, coming from beneath the floor. I lay still, paralyzed by fear, listening to the labored inhales and exhales that seemed to echo through the walls. The sound lasted for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes before fading into silence. The next morning, I checked the basement thoroughly. There was nothing unusual. No signs of animals, no strange holes or broken wood, just the usual clutter and dust. But I felt watched, and every time I was near the basement stairs, an icy chill ran down my spine. Days passed, and the noises grew more frequent. The scratching got louder, almost frantic, accompanied by faint whispering voices that I couldn't understand. I started hearing footsteps, slow, deliberate, pacing back and forth beneath the floor. The air around the basement door became thick and heavy, suffocating even during the daytime. One afternoon, I noticed the basement door was slightly ajar. I was sure I had locked it the night before. My pulse quickened as I pushed it open and shone my flashlight inside. The basement was dark, the shadows seeming to shift and move. I called out, but no one answered. I began to search, moving boxes aside, looking for any sign of an intruder. In the far corner, I found an old wooden panel that didn't match the rest of the wall. It was warped and cracked as if it had been removed and replaced hurriedly. My hands trembled as I pried it open, revealing a narrow crawl space beyond. Inside, the air was stale and thick with the smell of decay. I crawled forward, shining my light into the darkness. Deeper in, I found a pile of ragged blankets and what looked like human hair, tangled and matted. I nearly retched, my stomach twisting at the sight. I scrambled back and slammed the panel shut. The basement door slammed too, as if by an unseen hand. I ran upstairs, locked every door and window, and called the police. They arrived quickly, taking the crawl space and basement seriously after seeing my evidence. They found chains and shackles hidden beneath the floorboards, remnants of a forgotten torture chamber. It turned out that decades ago, the house had belonged to a man who was convicted of kidnapping and imprisoning several victims in his basement. The previous owners had been unaware, and the realtor hadn't mentioned it. I never went back down there. I moved out within a week, leaving everything behind except what I could carry. The memories stayed with me. The wet breathing in the night, the scraping nails, the feeling of being watched from beneath the floor. Sometimes I wonder if whatever was trapped down there is still waiting, hidden in the darkness, hungry for someone to find it again. Story the end. The house was a foreclosure. I don't remember the exact address, just that it was somewhere on the outskirts of a small town in Indiana. I was 23, freshly out of the military, and struggling to find a place I could afford that wasn't some run-down apartment or a shared room. The foreclosure was cheap, and the realtor assured me it was a great investment. Solid bones, he said. A fixer-upper with character. The basement was unfinished, but dry. And that was rare. It had potential, he said. I signed the papers and moved in on a late autumn day, the sky gray and the air heavy with the scent of rain. The first week was normal enough. I unpacked, fixed a leaky faucet, and slowly started settling in. The house creaked and groaned with age, and the heater rattled at odd hours, but nothing unexpected for a 70-year-old building. The basement was just a place to store boxes, tools, and some old furniture I'd found at a yard sale. I didn't spend much time there, and if I did, it was during the day when the sunlight filtered down through the small windows near the ceiling. On the seventh night, things changed. I was working late, finishing a freelance project on my laptop in the living room when I heard it. A low thumping from the basement. At first, I thought it was just the house settling, but the rhythm was too deliberate. Thump, pause, thump, 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 pause. It was coming from the far end near the furnace. Curious, I grabbed a flashlight and headed downstairs. The air was colder than usual, damp and musty. The light from my flashlight swept across the cracked cement floor and peeling paint on the walls. I didn't see anything out of place, no signs of animals, no dropped tools, nothing. Then the thumping stopped. I stood there for a moment, listening. Silence. I shrugged and headed back up. The next morning, I found a small pile of dirt near the furnace that hadn't been there before. It was fine, almost like sand, and I thought maybe a mouse had dragged in something or disturbed the ground. I swept it away. Over the next few nights, the noises increased. Not just thumping, but dragging, scratching, and sometimes whispering. The whispers were faint, almost indecipherable, but they chilled me to the bone. I started sleeping with the lights on. One night, I woke up to the basement door creaking open slowly. I sat bolt upright, heart pounding. The door was supposed to be shut tight. I grabbed the baseball bat next to my bed and crept toward the stairs. The door was slightly ajar. I peered down but saw nothing, just the empty, dark basement staring back at me. I closed the door, locked it, and went back to bed. I told a friend about it, Jake, a guy I'd met through work. He suggested it might be stress or maybe rats, but I knew it wasn't. A week later, I found scratches on the basement door, long, deep gouges like someone had been clawing at the wood with fingernails. I didn't notice them earlier because the door was painted a dull beige and the scratches were dark and smeared. The most disturbing thing? The scratches formed letters. I couldn't make out the words at first, but after staring for a long time, the phrase became clear. Let me out. I froze. I thought about calling the police, but what would I say? That my basement door was scratched with a message? They'd think I was crazy. Then came the smell. It was faint at first, like wet earth and rot, but it grew stronger each day until I could smell it all the way upstairs. The stench was sickening, making my stomach churn. I opened every window, ran fans, and cleaned obsessively, but nothing helped. One evening, I decided to check behind the furnace where the dirt had appeared. There, partially buried beneath a pile of old insulation, I found something. A small, rusted metal box, locked tight and covered in dirt and cobwebs. I tried to open it, but couldn't. The lock was old and brittle, but nothing I had would break it. The box felt heavy, cold. I carried it upstairs and placed it on the kitchen table. That night, I couldn't sleep. The whispers came again, louder this time, seeming to circle the room. I turned on every light and sat by the box, gripping the bat. At 3:17 a.m., I heard a faint click. The box lid had shifted slightly. I reached out, fingers trembling, and lifted the lid. Inside was a bundle of papers, yellowed and brittle with age. The handwriting was messy but clear. It was a diary. The first page told the story of a man named Henry, who lived in the house decades ago. He wrote about strange things in the basement, a presence he couldn't explain, watching him, whispering at night. He claimed the basement was built over an old root cellar used for something terrible. The last entry was chilling. Henry wrote about a figure he called the Keeper, who came to him in the dark, promising release if Henry helped free it. The diary ended abruptly. I spent days researching Henry and the house. I found newspaper clippings about a series of disappearances in the area during the 1940s, mostly children, all unsolved. Some rumors said the basement was used for occult rituals, though nothing was ever proven. I stopped going into the basement altogether. But the house didn't let me forget. One night, I woke to the sound of crying, a child's cry from downstairs. I tried to tell myself it was the wind or a radio from a neighbor's house, but it was too clear, too close. The next morning, I found muddy footprints on the basement stairs. They were small, like a child's. I packed my things and left that day. I still get nightmares sometimes. The last thing I heard before I left was a voice whispering my name, soft but urgent, from the basement door. I never returned. I don't know what the keeper wanted or if it was ever truly trapped, but whatever it was waiting. And it's still down there. Story the end.